All right, guys, so today we're going to be learning about React. React is a front-end framework that we use to develop nice web pages. It's basically, it's using JavaScript, but again, it's more than just vanilla JavaScript, what we've been using before. So yeah, we'll go over the basics, how to create a React app, understanding some basic concepts, like how do we manage values internally, how do we kind of structure everything, what files are associated with a React project. So let's kind of just dive right into it. So I know based on whatever scientific studies or learning education, I've heard that usually the first part of lectures and the last part of lectures are what stick with students the most. Usually the middle part, it's easy to maybe kind of get lost in all the terminology or all the examples. But again, the first thing we usually go over sticks in students' minds. So with that, I have a public service announcement that I kind of want to instill in your mind. So I got my burning flaming GIF here. This might not make sense to you guys right now, but I want to just present it right now because it's a very important concept. So this public service announcement is: do not manually edit state and prop values directly. Now, again, I know that probably makes not much sense to you guys right now, but just kind of remember these terms, state and props. They'll be coming up shortly, but the important thing to note here: do not manually edit them directly. All right, so I'm going to keep this up for maybe a couple seconds, have it burn in your mind, and then we'll proceed. All right, so with that PSA out of the way, let's kind of give our introduction into what is React. So React is a JavaScript library for developing user interfaces. Again, we were able to use CSS to kind of have some nice styling. JavaScript give us functionality. React kind of combines a lot of that so that, again, we can create much more richer user interfaces for our applications. Just some background about React. React was developed by Facebook. It is an open source library. So again, it's free to use. And it's heavily used throughout the web development industry. So it is a great technology to know about. It's mainly structured by creating and using something called components. So that's going to be our buzzword that we're going to focus on here. So let's go into, let's create our first React app, and then we'll talk about components. So luckily, there's pretty simple to set up a React app. Unfortunately, it takes a little bit of time for everything to kind of get set up here. So we're going to run these commands in our terminal. So the first command we're going to run is npx, which is similar to npm. And the command is create-react-app. And then you want to give your app a name. So you can name it whatever you want. There are some limitations in the naming. I believe you can only use lowercase. I don't think you can use underscores. Again, there's some criteria for that. So just know you might not be able to use anything for your name. Once we create a React app, we're going to hop into our directory and then run a command of npm start. All right, so let's do this together. I'm going to go to my coding window that I have open here. Looks like I need to update Visual Studio at some point. All right, so bring up my terminal. Here, I'm going to run npx create-react-app. All right, and I'm going to give my app a name. Since today is Monday, I'm going to just call it Monday app. Again, you guys can name it whatever you guys want to name it. But with that, I'm going to hit enter. So this is going to download a bunch of React libraries to my machine. Again, as I mentioned, this does take a while. So it can take upwards, from my case, again, based on your internet speed. For my case, it takes 45 seconds to a minute. So again, it is kind of long. So we'll come back to this window as it's finishing up.
Ankar, once it installs that, is this for every single time we create it, or is this a one-time thing?
Good question. This is every time we want to create a React app, we're going to be loading this command. So it's similar to how we did with Django, where we create a virtual environment and then install Django. In this case, we don't need a virtual environment, but we're going to run this for each individual app that we create.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yep. All right. So we will be going through the curriculum page. So again, this will be your reference point. So we ran our command here. npx create react app, gave our app a name. We're going to get into that directory and run a command of npm start once everything has completed. All right, so it's still running here. I think it's finishing up. I've been seeing this lately where we have like some critical updates. You can run npm audit fix dash force that might resolve some of the items. Again, your project still should run. I want to make that clear, but usually you want to try to clean up any higher critical issues. So we can try running this. Again, I've seen this multiple times, so I'm not sure what exactly is, oops, I need to get into my directory there. So I'm going to go into cd monday-app, which is my folder name. And then I'll run that command of npm audit fix dash force. Again, this was what the terminal kind of recommended me running to address these issues, one npm audit fix. So we'll run that. Again, that might clean up some of these issues. Regardless, you should be able to run your project if you see those errors or warnings. So let's let that run. Apologies for any background noise. Again, I have someone using a leaf blower there. All right, so it's trying to clean up some dependencies that might be out of sync. We'll see if it cleans all of them up. Okay, so again, we still have some warnings and some, I guess, critical items. Definitely want to address those, but again, this shouldn't hold up our project for today. So I'm going to just kind of ignore that for now. All right, so we ran create React app. Now we are in our React project. In this case, mine is called Monday app. In here, you want to run npm start. All right, if you hit enter, that is not what I want. All right, this is unexpected. There might be a problem with the project dependency tree. Did anyone else get this error by any chance?
I have the
I
same
got the
thing.
same thing.
Same thing.
Yeah,
All
me
right,
too.
so I definitely ran this yesterday and it worked. Maybe I don't want to run that audit. So let me try this again. Sorry for technical difficulties. So as
I
said,
didn't run the audit and I got the same thing too, Ankur.
yeah, maybe the audit kind of screws things
No,
up.
I mean, I didn't
I
run
didn't
the
run
audit.
the audit. I got it too.
Okay, that is not good for our project today. So I'm going to pause the recording here. Okay. All right, so after you run create React app, you should see this message of happy hacking. I'm gonna cd into my Monday app folder. All right, so I'm gonna run npm start, see if that works. If not, we might need a troubleshoot. So npm start here. All right, looks like it's proceeding on. So unfortunate error before, I'm not sure what caused it, but ideally you should be able to get a window that looks like this. So I'm gonna put this into here. So this is a browser window that should open up automatically. If not, you might need to manually open up a window. So you wanna go to localhost port 3000. That is the default port for React applications. It's gonna be running at port 3000. If you remember our Django projects, the default port for those projects were 8000. For whatever reason, React chooses 3000 as default port. You can kind of control that if you wanted to adjust it to a different port. But again, for now, we're just gonna go with the default here. Was everyone able to get to this page? If not, let's make sure everyone is at the same spot. So anyone have any issues?
I'm still
I'm not
installing.
able to resolve.
Gotcha. Okay, we'll give it a moment. Yeah, the installation can take a bit, especially depending on your internet speed. So let's wait for people to catch up. Meanwhile, let's kind of read our curriculum page. So again, if you were able to get everything successfully installed, if you do an npm start in your project directory, you should see a page that we just saw, similar to this.
Hey, Encore, I just had a question to ask before we get deep into it. But what exactly is the big difference between Django and React? Well, like what separates the two in such a way that React is more suitable for front end and Django is more suitable for back end?
Gotcha, great question. So Django is an ORM, so that is kind of built for creating like databases or database models and handling all the backend work for us. So if you remember Django, when using Django, we didn't have to write any raw SQL. We were able to create our models and work with those with the data from the database seamlessly. Django does provide front-end functionality, so we're able to create some of those template views and present a full stack application using Django. But Django, again, is pretty limited in terms of what we can do with those templates. So those templates were written in Jinja, which uses Python. And normally speaking, JavaScript is like the king of the web, as in everything for the most part uses JavaScript. So Python isn't normally used with web pages. It can be, as we saw with Jinja, but React is more suited for front-end development. One, because it's specifically a front-end technology versus Django is kind of like a do everything. So it's not great at front-end development. It is possible, but also React employs JavaScript, and JavaScript is like predominantly used for what front-end development. So again, React is really specialized. It has nothing to do with databases, has nothing to do with anything server-side. It is purely for your web pages.
I'll also add that React is very, when you design the front end, like the front end, everything is very modular. So you'll be able to see like what a component is, and a component is a reusable piece of code that you can employ, and you can make that piece of code, that UI, very dynamic. And you'll see it once we actually like jump into creating components and stuff.
Yeah, React has a lot of magic to it. It's really efficient. It like updates your page specifically what updated. It doesn't update everything. That's a key trait of it. Again, I'm sure Quinn Stevens will cover a lot of React details tomorrow. But yeah, it's a great question that you asked, Jason. But just know that React is specifically built for front-end development. So it's like specialized and really, really cool to use, I would say. All right, so hopefully with that time, everyone was able to get to this page here. Again, you should see the spinning logo for React. This is a default landing page for React, so we've not added anything to our app. So this is what we would see, similar to how Django has their default presentation or splash page when you initially launch a project. All right, so was everyone able to get here?
No.
No,
Mine will start, but then it says like failed to compile, and I like it will launch, but it's saying like I just go to white screen. I don't get that React screen.
Okay, cool. I'm actually curious again. I don't want to leave anyone behind. So I'm actually, Sean, could you actually share your screen? Let's actually troubleshoot, see if we can solve it. There's a couple other people I think that had some issues. Anything in particular? Or
Yeah, some kind of dependency issue with Babel Jest I've got.
All right.
Cloud9, it says my app's running, but if I try to bring it up in a window, it won't load.
All right, so we definitely have some different issues out there. I'm not sure if we can troubleshoot them all. I'm not familiar with this issue. Looks like Web Vitals. Was that something someone had to download? Was it Webpack or something? Let's see, error in Web Vitals. All right, unfortunately, yeah, I don't, it looks like you're in your trash folder. That might be an issue. Notice how your file path has trash in it. So Sean, yeah, I would try to create a new directory in your VS Code, like whatever project folder you're in. It looks like you're in week 8. Try to create a new subdirectory there and do a create React app and go through that. So I think, again, I might have led you down a wrong path where we deleted a folder and restarted. But again, it looks like you're working out of a folder that got moved to your trash.
Okay.
Yep,
So
not sure
if I installed something, like would that still be there if I moved like a directory? Like,
I think you probably need to run create React app from scratch again. But
okay.
yeah,
I'll give
sorry.
it a try.
I'm not sure if this will fix your issue. Again, I'm not familiar with this particular issue, but just wanted to see if we could see what that was. Is anyone else having any other issues? Again, I'm not sure if we'll be able to fix all of them right now, but just want to see if there's any general issues out there.
Can I throw my screen up?
Sure, go for it. Okay, yeah, so yeah, I saw the same exact thing where we had 16, 9, and 2 critical items. You're saying this is never completed, like it's still running?
I mean, it says it's running, right? So if I try to bring these up in either a window or a preview.
Okay, so yours is running on 8080 as the port. So what happens if you type localhost 8080 into your browser window? Yeah, just copy that URL and try pasting that.
Actually, can I say something here on Cloud9? If you actually go back to your browser, so go back to the code, you see preview like on the top, like near the run at the top window.
Yeah.
Click on it. And then there's on the second option, it says preview running application. If you click on it, it should open up like a browser. And if you kind of click on the top right where it kind of opened the window, there's like a, to the right of browser, there's like a little thing that opens up a separate window. So on Cloud9, it doesn't use a local host since it's kind of like a virtual machine. So it kind of develops its own URL that you have to click on the preview in order to kind of view your website.
No, thanks, man. Appreciate
Awesome.
that.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you so much. Again, I'm not too well versed with Cloud9, but yeah, anyone using Cloud9, hopefully that kind of clears up how to get to that page. All right, was there any other issues maybe we could try to quickly fix? Again, I don't want to.
Hi, Anchor. Yes, I got this error message. Ask me to fix the dependency tree. Can you take a look?
Sure. Yeah, feel free to throw it up. Yeah, I think I ran into that issue also. Again, I'm not sure what I did to kind of get there. Okay, this seems a little more scarier. So can you open up your Monday app folder there? Take a look. And you are, okay, so you have no modules. All right, so you have a.
I got the same thing.
Okay.
If you just delete and then reinstall and don't do the audit, it should work. I don't know if you tried that already.
Yeah, I already tried already. So I just created this app again, and I didn't do the npm, the error fix. So I didn't do this audit thing.
Okay, but you tried to run npm start, is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
All right, I would say best advice would be just follow the steps they're recommending: delete package lock, JSON, node modules, remove Babel jest. So again, we'll probably take this offline and try to work with you if you're unable to get it to work. But
Okay.
yeah, apologies if everyone's running into other issues, but hopefully most of you guys were able to get to this.
Anchor, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, so again, this is spinning app, kind of mesmerizing, but let's actually take a look at the files that got added for this React project. So there's a folder called node modules. Hopefully that looks somewhat familiar. When we're doing some other NPM libraries installations, we'd always get this node modules folder. Just know that this folder has all the libraries for React. So again, there's a bunch of them. When I say a bunch, I mean a bunch. So you guys can go through that at your leisure. For the most part, you never had to worry about this. You don't need to go into this folder or tinker with anything. So you can just leave it alone. Just know that everything that you just downloaded got added to this node modules folder in terms of React libraries. All right, so again, you never need to go into that. So don't worry about that folder. Then we have a public folder and a source folder. So let's take a look at the public folder first. This doesn't have too much in it. It has some resources like an icon. That's that spinning. That's not even the spinning logo, but we have some other images, whatever. The key file here in the public folder is the index.html. So this is our main HTML file. If you remember, for displaying web pages, you need an HTML file. This is the main entry point into our application. It's this index.html for presenting the web page. Again, for React apps, you do not need to modify this file at all. In fact, you should not. Just keep it as is. Anything in this public folder, we're not going to be touching anything in here either. So again, node modules, we leave it alone. Public folder, again, don't touch anything there. But then we have a source folder, SRC, short for source. This is where we actually will modify and add stuff to our React application. So in here, we have a few files. We have index.js. This is our main entry point into our JS logic or React logic. Again, this is something that we do not need to modify. So if you open this up, you should see something that looks like this. Pretty minimal code, but this is something called a component. So we're going to be dealing with components as we develop our app. But know that app is like the topmost or the roots level component for our application, thus named app. All right, so again, we do not need to modify anything in index.js, kind of leave that alone. We also have index, excuse me, index.css, as you might guess. This is where our styling kind of gets introduced. Again, we don't really need to modify any of the index files. So index.html, leave it alone. Index.js and index.css. Again, that's kind of just like the top level. We don't want to mess with that at all. But if we go to app.js, this is where
real
we'll,
quick.
Yep, go for it.
So I just got it to run. Have we made any changes to anything we've had yet?
Nope, no changes. Just kind of exploring all the files that get created.
Okay.
Yep. Cool. So in our src folder, again, we have index.js. We also have app.js. This is the main part where we will start editing our application. So if you recall, in our index.js, we have something called app. As I mentioned, this is a component. That component is actually defined in app.js. So if you look up here, we're actually importing app from our app.js. You can put JS here if you want to be clear about it, but it's the same thing. So this is opening up the app.js file, and that's where we're getting this app component for use here. All right, so if we look in app.js, we see some things in here, and this is actually what's being rendered to our screen right now. So if we have our browser still running, the spinning logo is actually coming from this app component. There's a SVG file. I think this is the actual thing that's spinning. So again, this is a file image format. SVG, I think it's like a vector format. But anyway, that's what we're loading in here. So notice that we have this logo, which we're importing from logo.svg. That's being used right here. So we have an image tag using that image, and then some fancy, I guess, graphics kind of getting that spin working. Okay, and then this learn React, that's part of a tag. Notice we have a link for learn React. So again, this is what's being rendered to our webpage. Any questions so far? But again, we're just kind of exploring the files that we have. We have not modified anything yet.
Just curious, how's it spinning? Is it from like the CSS or something?
I think the SVG, it's a vector format. Let's see, is it CSS? Let's actually find out. So we have CSS. Yep, there's an animation here.
It is.
Yep, you're right. So yeah, it's just a regular image, but looks like CSS accomplishes the animation for us. That's kind of cool. I've never really explored the animation attribute, but looks like that is what is generating it. So good question. So in app.css, that's where you find the app logo that kind of spins there.
Actually, if you look even lower, there's an app logo spin.
Ah,
Yeah.
Even better. All right, I'm glad you guys are kind of exploring there. But yeah, so our CSS is handling the animation there. Cool, good find there. All right, so we're not going to focus too much on CSS. Again, I really love CSS, but our main thing is going to be JavaScript and working with React. All right, so let's actually make a modification here. So as I mentioned, this. Yep.
I have a question.
Sure.
So when we create a new React app, we're pretty much going to delete everything in the sources folder and then recreate everything with our pages. Am I right?
No. Good question.
Okay.
We want to leave these items intact. So I guess index.js and index.css, that's what's connecting everything else that we create, all of our components, to our index.html. So remember how we always link our JS files to our HTML file? That's still being done between index.html and index.js. So again, we don't want to recreate those. Whatever's there, we want to keep that, because there's some code in here. Again, this is kind of like the entry point to our application. So yeah, we're not going to delete the source folder and recreate it. We just kind of want to add on to it though. So app.js, as I mentioned, is like the top level node or the top level component. So we'll talk about components in a bit, but let's kind of just modify what we have here. Now, if you kind of look at this, I'm sure you guys have the same thought that I'm probably having, is that this looks an awful lot like HTML, right? We see div tags, we see headers, image tags, paragraph tags. Essentially, this does look like HTML, and for the most part, it is HTML, but it's not really HTML. So we'll get to that distinction a bit, but we can write pretty much HTML here, and it's going to act as we would expect. So I'm going to actually take everything in the header and below and just delete it. So I'm getting rid of it, saying bye-bye. So I'm going to have this div, Class name app, I'm not going to change that because again, this has some styling functionality. Look at your app.css. Again, there's some styling going on there. I don't want to mess with that. But inside this div, I can add some code here. So let's actually add a simple maybe header and say hello world. All right, so the cool thing about React is that the server will automatically pick up your changes. So if you deleted what we had here before and add in a hello world, if you go back to your browser now, you should see something like this, hello world, on your web page. Was anyone not able to get their page to say hello world? There might be an issue for Windows users. I know there was a comment on our curriculum page. Scroll down a bit. You might need to run this. So look at the curriculum page. Again, I am not on a Windows machine, so I can't vouch for this. But if you did not have your server automatically update your view, you might need to, the simple fix would be to refresh your page manually. The more involved thing might be to set up this flag in your batch profile so that it automatically will update your page.
I didn't have any trouble with it.
All right, cool. Thanks, James. Hopefully everyone was able to get hello world shown on their browser. Any questions so far? All right, cool. So that is our first React app. Again, nothing too exciting. It looks like a basic HTML page, but we're definitely gonna get more React-y going forward here.
Sorry to interrupt, Anchor. So how did you get this hello world? I just have my page, so
yep,
I think I missed it.
Yep, absolutely. Great to kind of recap it in case anyone was still wondering. So inside of our source folder, src, we should have a few files that we see in here. So we have index.js, index.css, but the main one we're going to start interacting with is app.js. So if you go to app.js, you should see a function app. So this is what we call a component in React. This app component is returning something that looks like HTML. I'm gonna emphasize this is not actually HTML that we're returning, but it's pretty close to HTML in terms of syntax and what we're actually getting back. So in here, I deleted everything between my parent div and I added in a header for hello world. And following these steps, you should see your page update to hello world. So that spinning logo, which is kind of cool, went away because we deleted it from our web page. Okay, let's kind of continue on here. So looking at our curriculum page, we're going to take a step back. So all this is coded up in our curriculum page, but let's go back to the days of JavaScript. So we're not even going to think about React right now. Let's just think about JavaScript. So I'm going to kind of hack this in here. Hopefully you guys are fine with that. I'm going to go to my index.js page. Again, we normally do not edit this file. I want to make that clear. I'm just going to do this for our example right now. So for our example, I'm going to comment out my React app, and I'm going to just go back to good old JavaScript. So we've been doing this, we did this a few weeks ago. Let's get a quick reminder of using JavaScript. So I'm going to add in a window.onload method. If you remember, this is the first method that your JavaScript document will execute once your HTML document has loaded. So here we're going to do a few things. My goal, our goal today is going to be how do we dynamically add a button and a label to our web page. So right now, ignoring React, we're going to do this all in JavaScript and see how it's possible in JavaScript. So I'm going to kind of write some JavaScript code here. So I'm going to do let new button equals document. Remember, that's the DOM basically that we have access to. Document.create elements. If you remember, create element allows us to create new nodes that we will eventually need to attach to our page. So in this case, I'm going to create a button element. All right. And then now we want to give some attributes to our new button. So one thing is going to be an ID. I'm going to call it my button. Our new button will also need, let's see, maybe an on-click handler. So add event listener for a click action. And then that'll be responded to by or handled by on button click, which will be a method we create. So let's create that quickly. Again, if I'm going too fast, please let me know. But I'm just kind of, again, we're doing this all in JavaScript just to have a good trip down memory lane. Function. Actually, let's use a fat arrow function. So all right, so again, you don't necessarily need to follow along with this part, but you're definitely welcome to. But so on button click will handle when we click this button. What else do we want to do here? Please mute yourself if you are not muted in the Zoom chat. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question here,
Sure.
Ankur.
Go for it.
So under the window.onload event listener, we have on button click, and then we named on line 30 our function on button clicked. I wanted to make sure that
Oh,
those were
yes,
supposed to be
thank you.
different.
Yep, that is my bad. Thank you. You guys always look out for me. Yeah, definitely want those names to match. So on button clicked is what I want to name my function. Let's create a label. So this would be document.create. I'm going to make this a paragraph. So I call it a label. Just, I don't know why I call it a label. It's tradition, but it's just a paragraph tag that shows some text. So that's why I call it a label. This new label will have an ID. So we'll do ID equals my output. And I don't know if we need, we need some inner HTML. So we'll do new label dot inner HTML will be you clicked the button a certain number of times. We're going to have a counter. We're going to use string interpolation here. So if you guys remember your backticks and $ before your value. All right, so we're going to have some counter. So again, our goal here is we're going to create a button. And then every time we click that button, we want to update a counter and then show that display on our web page. All right, so a minimal functional website that has some interactivity to it. So I'm going to create a global variable. I'm going to call it counter. So it's going to start at 0. So let counter equal 0. And then that counter value will be displayed in our label. Finally, so we created a new button node, right? So new button. Then we also create a new paragraph elements. So keep in mind that these are elements we've created, but they're not attached to our document just yet. So to attach it, we need to find something that exists. One way to do it is to find something that exists in our document already. So let's go to our HTML file. So we're going to index.html and just trying to pick out something that exists. So looking at my body section, looks like that I have a div called root. So an ID of root. So I'm going to basically insert everything inside this root div. I could do it at the body level, but I'm just going to choose to do it here since there's an ID provided. So again, I'm not messing with my index.html file. I'm just trying to identify something I could attach my new nodes to. So I go back to my JavaScript I was writing. I'm going to do a let root element equals document. I can remember gets element by ID is a handy JavaScript function that could get an item by its ID. In this case, the ID is called root. Now that we have the root elements, we're going to append child. New button was one of the elements we created, and then root elements, append child, the new label that we created. All right, so these two steps will actually add those nodes to our page. I think one thing I forgot was for my button, I probably want something on my button. So do enter HTML and say, click me as a text. So again, just to review what we did, we created a brand new element using JavaScript. We give that element an ID so that we can identify it at some point. Inner HTML is actually what the user sees, so the content of that element. And then we added an event listener because that button's eventually going to be clicked and we want to do something in result of that click. All right, so given this code that we just added, let's see if that actually adds something to our page. Refresh here. Oh, target containers, yada, yada. All right, what do I do here? Oh, I forgot to do that. So I commented out my React, but I kept document get element ID. That's what I want. What's going on here? Do I just keep this here then? Okay, cool. So it looks like I don't want to comment this out. Sorry for that false lead. I'm just going to delete my hello world. I don't want this showing anything. All right, so again, app.js no longer has anything inside the div. Index.js still has that strict mode, but it's not really going to show anything because app has nothing that's really rendering. So given that, you should see something like this. So this is that button that we added. Then we also have a counter, right? Right now, when we click this button, nothing really happens, right? This counter stays at 0 because we've not really attached any logic to this click, right? So let me make a couple more changes just for my sanity. Let's go to, I kind of want to center this button just for fun. Let's go to index.cs, maybe modify roots. All right, so root here is going to use Flexbox, just get some CSS going here. What else do we want? Flex, align items center. Does that do it? All right, that kind of does it. Flex flow of column. And then, all right, there we go. So again, I'm using Flexbox just to center everything. Again, you don't have to center it. I think it's a little easier for everyone to see if I center these items. So we have a button and then we have a label. Again, I just added some basic Flexbox functionality, display flex, flex flow column, and then center for line items. Again, you guys don't have to mess with the CSS. I just wanted to center it there. Okay, let's go back to our JavaScript. So looking at what we've done, again, we're able to use JavaScript and create components or elements dynamically, right? So we have this button, we have this label. Again, this is not hard coded in our HTML file. This is all dynamically created for us. Let's get our click button working here, and then we should be able to see some functionality. So on button clicks, I know which button is going to be clicked because we don't have multiple items calling this handler. So I'm just going to assume that we have new button being clicked. And then from that, I want to update counter. So remember, we had this counter variable. Again, let me just add some space here, make it clear we're just modifying JavaScript. Click counter. So this counter is what's going to keep track of how many times we clicked our button. So let's increment our counter, right? We want to increment click counter. And then we want to update our label. So we have our label with an ID of my output. Since we gave it an ID, we should be able to extract that label by doing let's label element equals documents dot gets elements by ID. And the ID for that label was my dash output. Right, so we're just finding that element or that label that we created, or I guess it's the paragraph tag that we created. We want to update its inner HTML. So label elements equals, you click this button counter times. And since I catch myself copying code, right, I have two places with the same logic. This goes back to our basic, development skills. We usually never want to be repeating ourselves in this manner, because if I wanted to change the output here, you clicked the awesome button, let's say that's my output. Well, now I need to go back to every other place that has the same, same logic and update that because I need to keep them in sync. So usually anytime you catch yourself writing redundant logic, it's probably a good case to nest that into a function. I'm going to do const get label text. Again, this is going to be a very simple function. You might say, well, it seems kind of silly to create a function just for this purpose. But again, proper design is reducing redundancies and duplicated code. So in this case, all this will return is what I want it to show, and it's going to use the counter value part of that. So now that I have that function, I'll do get label text, right? So that's just going to return a string with the counter value interpolated there. And I could also use that function here, so I don't need to duplicate myself. Oh, this would be inner HTML, my bad. So the inner HTML will be set to the text. All right, so we increment counter and then update our label display. Hopefully that wasn't too quick, but any questions about the JavaScript that we're writing? Again, a lot of this should be review. Again, we've worked with create element, get element by ID. So hopefully you kind of understand what we're doing here, kind of how everything's working. But what questions do you guys have about our JavaScript?
Could you just scroll back down to see the bottom? Thanks. Yep.
All right, assuming that we wired everything correctly in terms of on button click should be called when we click our button. that should increment our internal counter, and our label should be updating because our counter is part of the label display. So let's actually see if this works, or if not, we will need to troubleshoot. If I go back to my web page, okay, looks like I am missing something. Let's take a look. So we have our click handler, add event listener, all button clicked, counter. That all looks correct to me. So good time to bring up our developer panel, see what's going on here. Console as well. Okay. All right, getting no errors here. Looks like this is working though. So let's do some console login. So console log.
Did it work for you? Ankur, it works for me, and I think I have everything you have.
Yeah, I might have just mistyped something. I make typos all the time. So I'm gonna add some console log just to check out, make sure my values are correct. So I'm gonna put a console log after counter that should be incremented. Let's make sure that we have stuff for new button, new label, and new elements. So console log these 3 values. Make sure we're actually getting something and not dealing with something that's null. Maybe I need to refresh my page. That could be it too. Let's take a look. So let's refresh for good measure. Okay, click. All right, there we go. I think I just need a refresh there. So notice I get the correct console logs and my label is updating. So that's what we wanted. Notice we can just go on forever. Our counter keeps going up and up. All right, any questions? Were you guys able to get that to work with the JavaScript we added? All right, so that was JavaScript. Again, nothing new here really. We've done this before. This is vanilla JavaScript working with our HTML page. But again, taking a look at the code, it's not too terrible. Again, we added 2 elements, not a whole lot. But I mean, our code sort of is bulky for just adding 2 elements, right? Like this isn't much to show for all the code that I've written. But again, it's not too much. I'm not trying to dramatically exaggerate how much work we had to do there. But this isn't the best approach. When I say best, again, that's where React comes into play here. So let's take a quick break, and then afterwards, we'll see why React kind of makes this process much simpler. So it's 10:34 here. So we got our button working. Again, this is all in JavaScript, nothing React specific that we had to really do. But cool, got some functionality here. But as you said, we had to write some lengthy JavaScript here. But let's actually see how React can make this much simpler for us. So I'm going to take all the code we wrote and kind of just comment it out. We don't really need it. That was just for example's sake. Again, normally, just to reiterate, you do not need to mess with index.js. I just did it right now just to get our JS in there. But no, normally you just keep this file untouched. We want to mess with the app component to add our logic. So app.js, this is where we'll be adding some items. Let's take a step back and learn about components though. So we introduced the idea of components, mainly structured by creating using components. What are components? So components are essentially user-defined HTML tags, but more than that. So if you want to create a component, I have a snippet of code here where we have a couple of variables. We create a component and use it by having angle brackets, again, very similar to HTML syntax, where we have an element and the element name. Here we have a component with a component name. And then these items are properties. So if we're contrasting with HTML elements, so you have elements that have attributes. In React terminology, we have components that have properties. In this case, the Pop Platoon component has 2 properties that we're setting, students and description. All right, so components, will work with them in a bit. The key thing here I want to mention is that we're actually using JSX in React. So when I mentioned that we had code that looks like HTML, so like right here, where we had h1 hello world. As I mentioned, this looks like HTML, but this is actually what we call JSX. JSX is essentially a hybrid syntax where we can use JavaScript within HTML syntax. So here, I've defined it as a marriage syntax between JavaScript and HTML. If you jump back to our Django week, recall we were using Jinja, which allowed us to write Python within our HTML. This is the same idea that we're using with JSX here. We're able to write raw JavaScript right inside of our HTML syntax. The key thing about components is that this offers us reusability within our React apps. And we'll see this shortly, but again, reusability is one of our core principles of development. Again, we don't want to write the same thing over and over again. We want to reuse code to make our lives easier and to make maintaining our code much easier too. All right, so components. As I mentioned, this app right here is called a component. In this case, this is specifically a functional component. There are two variants of syntax that you will see. There's functional components and class-based components. Both of them achieve the same exact thing. It's just different syntax with regard to creating the component. For our purposes, we're going to be focusing on functional components. The main reason is because like the official developers of React have kind of made a decision that functional components are the way to go. But unfortunately, the previous kind of methodology was to use class-based components. So we're kind of in this like intermediate state where a lot of code that you might be dealing with for your like future projects might be written with class-based components. So it is definitely important that we understand class-based component syntax. But with that said, again, a lot of like the new wave is kind of working with functional components. So we're going to be focusing on functional components for a lot of our challenges and our coding examples, but we will also introduce class-based syntax just so that we're familiar with it. But for now, we're just going to learn one syntax. It's hard enough to learn one, so we're not going to kind of learn both at the same time right now. We're going to focus on functional components. So syntax is pretty much as simple as writing a function. So in here, we have a function keyword, the name of our function. One thing I want to point out is we use an uppercase for component naming. Normally for functions, if you remember, we use like a lowercase, like our normal function would be function, my function, and we give it a body. So again, same syntax for creating the function, but the naming, just to highlight it, we use a capital letter to start it out just for naming conventions. You don't, so just keep that in mind. So we have app here, this is a component, and we have one return statement. Each component you create should return JSX from the function return. So in this case, we're returning JSX. So the stuff I've highlighted here is JSX, but we can write just simple JavaScript here if we wanted to, like if I wanted to, do a console log. Again, this is just like any other function we'd write normally. So if I want to console log hello world, again, I'm writing raw, like pure JavaScript here, because this is JavaScript, but inside my return statement, this is what we call JSX, which is that thing that looks like HTML syntax, but is actually not quite HTML syntax. What questions do you guys have about creating a basic component? So again, if you're following on a curriculum page, the bare bones for a component is as simple as this. So we create a function and return JSX. That's all you need to have a functional component. Obviously, you could add more to it. And if you scroll up a bit from where I am, we actually have this component coded up here. So I'm just going to copy this to make sure I don't miss anything. So again, this is from our curriculum page. We could paste that here and make sure we understand it all. All right, so there are a few new things that we introduced here. We'll cover it all, I promise, but just to kind of see what we've done here. We've imported a few items. We have some values. Again, this use state is something that we will cover. It's unfamiliar to a lot of us right now. Let's take a look at our core return code here. So we're returning some JSX, but notice we have exactly what we had before, where we have a button with an ID of my button. We have an on-click handler, and then we have a button that says click me. Likewise, we have a paragraph tag with an ID and a description, or I guess output of what we want to see here. So again, this is the same thing, essentially, what we did with our JavaScript, but this is much more, I would argue, much easier to read and much easier for a developer to kind of create this, because that's this, at the end of the day, this is essentially the HTML we want to see on our HTML document. So we're returning this, and if we make these changes, so again, just to review, I've commented out all my JavaScript that I wrote before. I have my app component. Inside my app component, I'm returning this bit of code here. I'm going to leave this up for a second in case you are trying to write that, but again, I copy this all from the curriculum page, just kind of expedite the process. Again, we'll talk about what useState is doing. We have an event handler. This should be pretty straightforward, where when we click on our button, we have an on-click action that's going to be handled by our increment counter, and that will do something to our counter value. But this stuff we will cover momentarily, so stay tuned. But let's take a look at what this actually renders. So the return value is what's actually returned from this component. That's what will be rendered to our screen. So if I go back to my screen, refresh, notice that I still have the same look as before. In fact, if you guys want to see like the difference or not the difference, I'm going to uncomment my JavaScript since I kept it here. All right, so here I should see something. So refresh here. Notice I have two almost identical things. Looks like I have a typo here, or I had you here and you here. So that's, this part is my React component. This part is my pure raw JavaScript. They do the same exact thing. Click this, click this. Oop, looks like it's updating the wrong thing though. Can anyone tell me why it's updating this item? I should expect it.
Is that the first
The
element
label is the
that's
same.
named for that ID?
Yep. Seth has it. I think a couple other people mentioned it. In this case, we have two elements. This paragraph and this paragraph have the same exact ID. If you remember back from our HTML discussions, you should never have two elements with the same ID on the same page. This is a great example of why you'll get into some errors, because an ID should be unique. So when I click this button, it's looking for an item called my output, and it finds something, so it updates that. So yeah, this is inadvertently kind of not what I wanted. I could quickly fix this if I want to. Let's just do it for good measure. I'll call this my output 2, not great naming. My output 2, probably call my button something else also. And yep, that should be all I need to do. Update that. Okay, so let's see with those changes. All right, click this, updates that. All right, there we go. So again, JavaScript down here, React up here. All right, so hopefully that you guys believe that both of these are accomplishing the same items. I'm going to comment out my JavaScript again. Let's go to our React app. So again, our component is returning essentially what we want to see on our page. But again, we did introduce some new items. So let's actually talk about those new syntactical items for our React component. So the stuff I've highlighted here is kind of using some of that new items. So the first thing I want to talk about are state values. I think I have a slide that might be relevant. All right, so we talked about function-based components. So let's take a step back. So function-based components, basically, as you might guess, uses functions to represent components. This is the preferred way to structure components. Class-based components, as we talked about, they will be using classes to represent components. The preferred way to structure components from the past. So again, we're kind of in that transition state where the past was class-based components, the future is going to be function-based components. Now we might be developing either. So it's important to kind of understand the syntax for both. But again, remember that both of them achieve the same exact thing. At the end of the day, your user is not going to be able to tell if you're using function-based components or class-based components in the backend, because again, it outputs the same exact thing. Now let's talk about states, and we're going to be talking about props also. So first, focus on states. What are state values? This is a React terminology, but state values are values that are internal data for a particular component. Right? So state values, again, just terminology. We call them state values when they're internal values to a specific component. So let's go back to our code snippet and make sure we understand, again, everything that we kind of wrote or copied here. So the first thing I want to highlight here is this function called useState. This is something coming from our React library. So notice that we have to import it. We import useState from React. This structure right here is something called destructuring. So we're actually just grabbing useState from the React library. We're not importing the entire React module here. Given that we import it, we can use it in our functional component. So let's talk about what useState is doing. This is, again, React specific. This is actually doing two things. This is taking in, I'm going to add some comments below, I guess. useState. Let's detail what's going on here. So input, there's one input value, and this is the initial value for our state variable. All right, so this value right here, 0, is the input that we're passing into useState. That is the initial value that we're giving it. So in this case, the initial value will be 0 for the state value we're creating. We're returning 2 items for our output. One is our state variable, and the second is an updating function for our state variable. All right, so notice the syntax here might be a little foreign for us, but we're actually capturing 2 values from this function. We're capturing one item in counter and the second item in something we named set counter. The key thing I want to mention here is these are variable names, meaning I can name them whatever I want to. Again, my default example is I can name this donuts. I can name this set something. Again, these are just variables. Naming restrictions still apply, but these are variables I'm creating for my use cases. In this case, I don't want to call it donuts. I want rather call it counter. This function, again, this second value is a function that's being returned. We're capturing that in a variable, and I'm going to call that set counter. All right, I want to make sure I'm not going too quickly. Again, useState is a React function, so it's not a function we created. It's a function that exists from the React libraries. This takes in one parameter that is the default value or the initial value you want to give to your state value. So in this case, I'm creating a counter that is a state value, and it's going to take on an initial value of 0. Additionally, I get a function back that we're going to use shortly for updating our counter values. This is a great time to kind of go back to my PSA from earlier. Again, we do not and should not manually edit state values directly. That is why we have this updating function. So let's go back here. So we have this setting function, and we use that down here on line 13. So again, we create a state value using useState. Important thing I want to highlight is useState is specific to functional components. So again, for the most part, we're going to be focusing on functional components, but I want to make that distinction because if we get to class-based components, we won't be using useState. I feel like I'm going maybe a little quickly or not pausing enough for questions. So what questions do you guys have about useState?
I have a question. Can you just kind of like visually demonstrate like what you mean by don't manually update the state?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked, Sean. So when we say don't manually edit state values directly, what I mean by that is I've created a state value called counter here. What we say not to do is, let's say I want to increment counter. So let me comment out this line of code that I had before. I could increment counter by simply doing counter equals counter plus 1. Or if you're, have your shortcut in there, your shortcut syntax, do plus equals 1, same thing, right? This is going to update the value of counter. I want to be clear that this works, as in counter will get updated. But this doesn't work in the React world in terms of what React wants us to do. So although this will update counter, React is not going to be happy with us. And we're going to see why React is not going to be happy with us. So Sean, I'm glad you asked that question. We will see the incorrect behavior in a moment, but let me just kind of tackle the proper way to code stuff. So here, when we actually want to increment, maybe I should keep that code around because we're gonna have it come back. So this is bad. Let me make that clear. Bad. Exclamations. This is the proper way to do it. Maybe put this above. Sorry for my switching. All right. This is the good way or the proper way. All right, so the proper way is we have this updating function that is returned from useState. And here we can update our counter value. This is getting a little more nuanced. I could, for simplicity's sake, I could simply do counter plus 1 here. Again, I want to be, I guess, proper with our examples, but also don't want to confuse you guys. So we theoretically could put counter plus 1 here and it will work pretty much the way we want it to. So here, what we're saying is, hey, this is going to be the new value that we want counter to be set to. So instead of directly updating counter, right? Instead of doing counter equals counter plus 1, the new value we want is counter plus 1. We want to increment it by 1. but we don't want to assign it directly. Instead, we want to use our function and pass the new value to our function, and that'll update counter for us automatically. What questions you guys? What questions you guys have about set counter? Yep, question.
On this one, I see set counter on line 17 as a function, but it's nested inside of another function called increment counter, which is not being called. So I just wonder, like, why is that inside another function that we're not really using?
Good question. So we are using it. So let's go back down to our return statement. So we're actually using it as a handler right here. Yep. So that when we click that button, this increment counter will then be called. So yeah, we're not calling it directly right now, but it'll be called in response to some action from the web page. So again, when that button gets clicked, this block of code will get run. Okay, what questions? Any questions about set counter? Do you guys understand kind of how use state is giving us some values? Again, the values are the actual, data that we want to keep track of, and a function to update that data. Because in React, again, you should not update state values directly.
Not a question about set counter, but I don't understand why we have both an index.js file and an app.js file.
Sure. So index.js is like the top level JavaScript file. That's where your JavaScript application actually begins. So in here, again, we don't need to modify anything in here. This block of code is actually where we actually start introducing components. So this is just a JavaScript file, and we are using React DOM.render, and that's where we start introducing React components. So again, index.js is just the top level. App.js is where we want to start coding in our React logic. Why is there separation? I guess I don't have a great answer for it. Just know that index.js we don't want to modify. App.js is where we start writing our application. But index.js is what connects to index.html. Like, it's going to be importing it if we dig through it. I'm sure we could find it somewhere. Somewhere. All right. I don't know where it is, but there's some link being made somewhere that I can't find right now. All right. Well, was there a question, Jonathan?
Yeah, is it a fair comparison to say that index.js is like manage.py?
Maybe, I don't know. We use it in a different way, like totally different world. But yeah, again, it's the entry point. So it's the first thing that gets called. So in that sense, yes. Index.js, again, this is the first thing that happens. And since we are rendering an app component, our logic kind of bubbles down to that. So if you think about function calls, right? This is sort of like, all right, we have our top level application, we're calling a function here, and that function is going to do additional logic. So
inside your package if you want to open up your package.json file, where is it? Is it even in there? Scroll up. Okay.
Are you looking for that link?
I was just looking for the entry point. So I think in your inner manifest, essentially, when we get into Babel and stuff, that's where it tells the React application what file to look at. And it first looks at the entry point is the index.js for the JavaScript file and the index.html for like to display the HTML file.
Cool. Yep. Again, a lot of things going behind the scene, but yeah, index.js is how we get into JavaScript world, and then app.js is how we kind of get into our React world, is the simplified way I would say it. But yeah, again, let's just focus on app.js, index.js. We're not going to be messing with that. But all right, so let's get back to set counter. Again, this is the appropriate way we should be updating our state value. So you create multiple state values, const, value, and then set value. Again, by naming conventions, you usually want to name your updating function, set value or update value, whatever you think is appropriate. But again, you don't have to. It's just a name for a variable.
Ankur, may I ask a question on line 6?
Yes.
I feel like this is something I should understand, but it's just not sticking in my head. Line 6, we're creating 2 variables called counter, or we're assigning something from, we're assigning things to counter and set counter. Is that right? We're assigning things to counter and set counter, which are, like you said, names we came up with. They're in an array because use state is going to return an array of two things. And that allows us to like assign those two things. Is that how it is?
Yes, use state is returning 2 items, not 1 item. So we're capturing them in a list here.
Okay. And it's like, we couldn't like, and I'm just like kind of trying to wrap my head around JavaScript a little bit too. Like it has to be in an array, right? We couldn't just have counter comma set counter equals that. Like it needs to be in an array
It's a good question.
in order to unpack that. I'm just like not sure I understand that part.
Yeah, so yeah, it looks like we can't just have it as comma. So yeah, it looks like it is returning a list. Can we have a tuple actually? I'm curious. Nope, looks like we need a list. Yeah, so I think it just use state is returning a list. So that's why we want to capture it as a list, would be my guess there. All right, This is a great thing I ran into. Occasionally you'll see something that looks really horrendous like this on your React app in your browser. This is totally fine. This occasionally happens. If you see anything that looks akin to this, that just means your React server failed miserably. It's not something that you did wrong. So if I refresh here, that should fix everything. So again, sometimes it happens that your React server just can't recover from whatever changes you made. So just know, don't freak out if you see that horrible message. That just means refresh your page, you should be good to go. All right.
And then Ankur, use state, the value we pass to use state, is that 0 then? That's what we're assigning to counter. Is that correct? So counter is now 0. So if you said use state was 5, counter would be equal to 5.
Yep. So if I set it to 5, let's actually refresh our page. So if I refresh my page, notice that we start at 5 here. So yep, that is the initial value.
Okay. And then my last question is set counter back on line 6 there. Set counter, I guess where I'm a little bit confused is how is use state returning a function name that we're just, I feel like it's like this catch-22. We're the ones who decide what the function is. How is use state returning? I don't know. That's where I'm a little bit confused. It seems like it's.
Yeah, just to cover that. So again, these are just variable names that we're creating. I could totally call this counter and I could call this set something. This name does not need to match my state value, right? So by tradition or by like just naming convention, we usually want to name it the same. So if I have something called counter, I usually want to just call my function variable set counter, but I don't have to. Again, set something totally works. So it's just a naming convention that we're following there.
Okay, and then when I call the set something then I can go on to make a function called set something, and like I can have a function inside set something that then adjusts counter in whatever way.
Yeah. So again, this set something is being passed to us. We don't need to mess with it. It's going to update our counter value automatically. This is React magic behind the scenes. Just to again make sure we're clear on what's happening here. We could create a function like function my function, and that could do whatever it wants. We could assign my function to a variable. So we do let func pointer, what I want to call it, equals my function, right? So now I have a variable that is capturing the function here. So if I ever want to call my function, I could do that by doing func pointer and then call it like this. So again, this is a variable, but it's storing a function reference. So you can use that variable just like a function. That's what's going on up here. We're getting passed back a function reference so that we can call that as if it were a function, and that's going to trigger whether a function was being referenced by this variable. Does that all kind of make sense, or did I kind of?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. So it's passing us a function reference, and that function reference we give a name to, or we assign to, but that function reference also takes a function that we will later create. Okay, I think I get that.
Well, I was with you until the last part. So
all right. So like, I guess what's strange to me is, and I don't mean to belabor this point. I probably just need to stop.
That's a good question.
We're the ones who decide what the function is, the update function. We're the one creating that update function, aren't we?
We are creating the variable that holds a reference to it. So my ref here is a variable I've created. So we're storing a function reference here. So again, this function, function that exists in React or whatever JS, let's imagine a function just exists somewhere else. If we get a reference to it, now we can refer to this function anytime we want. It's as if we're directly calling the function, but we're calling it through this reference. So this reference is just pointing to wherever this function exists in memory, so that we can just call that as if it were a function.
Okay, I guess where I'm a little confused is the first example, before you had counter plus one inside your set function or whatever the name of it, a set counter,
Yep.
you had a function in there. So
Okay.
inside set something, you had a function. And so like in my mind, whatever's inside the parentheses of set counter is the function that, like, because we could increment the counter by the log of 5, you know, like the log, like that change that we make, that change of state, I guess is what I was referring to when I say we pass a function.
Yeah, so
but-
again, that was a detour that I took. So we will talk about that. So I mentioned this isn't the fully proper way to do this. And then again, this is a little nuance. And again, for our introduction, I don't want to kind of lose you guys here. So for simplicity's sake, set counter can just take in your new value. And then that's going to update your counter value. Let's just kind of take that as granted. There's a little more to it. But for now, I'm just going to go with this example. So set whatever your set function is, or your updating function, you just pass it the new value and I'll update your state value. All right, let's actually, so if you guys remember this works correctly, let's set this back to 0. So I want to start at 0. So again, this works just fine. Now let's kind of highlight why state value should not be updated directly. So I'm going to go back to my code, uncomment my bad code, comment out my good code. Let's do a console log right here. So I'm going to print out the value counter after I implement it. And let's see what actually happens. So I'm going to save my code. React automatically refreshes. So your server automatically refreshes, gives you some warnings. All right, I'm not actually using these values. That's fine. All right. Oh, let's make that left then, since it's complaining about const. All right, set counter is assigned, but value is never used. That's fine, because we're never using the updating function, because I commented it out. But now that I'm updating counter directly, let's see what happens here. So refresh my page. I'm clicking this button now, but my value is not updating. What is going on here? So let me open up my developer panel, because I have a console log. Notice that I'm actually getting that increment. So let me refresh my page. Right, every time I click, I'm getting the new value of counter displayed here. So this shows me that counter is being updated when I update it directly, right? That is working. My counter value is correctly being updated. But notice that my label still says I've clicked this button 0 times, even though my counter is up to 8 now. Why is this happening? Well, the short answer is because we're doing things incorrectly. We're updating a state value directly, which is, again, we've emphasized you should not be doing this, because React is not going to work the way you expect it to when you update things directly. So what's happening here is our value that we created is being incremented, but React never knows that it needs to re-render our components. So what I mean by that is this paragraph element here is relying on counter. So every time counter changes, we ideally want this piece of code to be ran again, because counter needs to be reflected in this paragraph. However, React does not know that we've incremented counter in this event handler. Therefore, it does not rerun this re-render for our components. Right, so this is all in our app component. Whatever we're returning here is what what gets rendered to our screen. React, again, automatically updates things when you update your rendering, but in this case, it doesn't know that this is updated. If we ever get an automatic refresh somehow, well, our counter will look correct. If you want to actually see this, let's actually, how can I hack this in here? Let's create another state value. Let's say let's something set something. Again, I'm just going to hack this in here, so hopefully you guys can follow along. Set something. It's going to be a new state value, so use state. Let's say the value will be, again, we use strings, so this would be donuts. Set something. All right, so now I have another state value. The way React works is that it will automatically re-render when any state value or prop value, we haven't talked about props, updates. So in this case, if I somehow get something to update, I should get a re-trigger of my re-render. So let's, how would we do this? Maybe we want, is there a function I can use here? Let's try drag. I don't know if this is a legit action that can work for me, but let's say on update something. I don't want to call it that, but on drag. All right, so again, I'm just trying to get something where I could do an action that will trigger my other state value. So on drag, let's make that anonymous. This is going to update my set something value. So I don't know why I called it set something. Set something, we're going to change from donuts to, let's say, cupcakes. All right, and then we want to use that somewhere here. So let's add that as our button text. That works. You guys with me? So now I'm using that state value as the text for my button. So it's going to be, say, donuts initially. When I try to drag my button, again, I'm not sure if this will work. That should trigger my drag handler, which means my state value should update, which should trigger a re-render. Because again, this is the proper way to update a state value. This will notify React that something's changing, and that will force a re-render. So let's try this and see if it works. So again, my button's broken. Notice that I get my incrementing, but my label doesn't change. Let me try dragging my button. So I'm going to click. Oops, that didn't work. All right, drag doesn't seem to work here. Let's try another function quickly. Does anyone know one? Blur, maybe?
You going mouse over or something like that?
Yeah, then I can't get the click to work though. On mouse leave. There we go. Let's try that. Thank you for the suggestion though. Just trying to hack this in here. It's not the best example here, but okay. So now when my mouse leaves, it should trigger this function. So when it leaves the area of the button is what I'm thinking. So let's try this again. I click. All right, we get the incrementing, but my label doesn't update. Let me leave the area of the button. All right, so notice this updates the cupcakes, but this still stayed at 0 because this is still depending on counter. So I guess that didn't achieve what I wanted to. So what I believe is going on here is that this part was not re-rendered because React was smart enough to know that, hey, counter for its purposes has never updated. So I guess in this case, if we added maybe something here. So now that this component will be forced to update because something is also a part of this output. So let's add something at the very end. All right, so let's try this again. All right, so we have cupcakes. Let's go back to donuts. All right, so again, we're rendering something here, which means if this ever changes, this will need to change. Let's see if this works. I'm actually curious. So we click. Yeah. Still an update. All right, interesting. So still, the main takeaway here is we've updated the counter incorrectly. So React never picks up that update for the counter value, even though counter is being updated behind the scenes. So again, React is smart enough to know what part changed. So it looks like it just thinks it's 0 and never updates from there. So in summary, this is bad. It updates counter, but React does not know counter is updated. Question, Guillermo.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to understand is you actually have to use the partner function. So React knows that the counter is being incremented because it re-renders per component.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it re-renders based on what values are being used. So since counter is being used here, it's going to re-render this anytime it detects counter changing.
Gotcha. But for that one specifically, you didn't use this partner function. That's why it's not updating.
Correct.
Okay.
So again, React is not re-rendering everything necessarily. It's going to compute. So I guess getting a little more technical, React computes what it needs to re-render. And then when it gets to the screen, it's going to compare what it needs to update with what's on the screen already. It detects changes on the screen and only updates that part of the screen. So again, React is really smart and really efficient in terms of updating, because when you refresh your page, it has to load everything. And of course, I left some stuff in my bad example. When you refresh a page, everything needs to be reloaded. So again, this is really simple example. We have two elements, nothing too crazy. When we had a lot of resources on this page, every refresh needs to load everything again, which is inefficient. React, again, being smart enough, will just only look for things that change and update that part of your page, not everything on your page. That's another benefit of using React. All right, any questions about bad usage and good usage of updating state values?
Yep, for set counter, how come, like I saw previously we had like previous counter and then fat arrow previous counter +1. How come we changed it to just counter +1?
Great question. So as I mentioned, I didn't want to get too into it, but it is something that is important to know. So I'm not trying to kind of hide what we're trying to do here. Counter +1. All right, let's talk about this. If you guys kind of get confused by this, if I lose you guys, I think we'll definitely cover. I'm sure React Quinn will get into it. If not, we'll touch on this again. What's the difference between doing this and doing this? The first version takes in a value. The second version takes in an anonymous function. So if you guys remember your fat arrow syntax, this is a fat arrow function. If I wanted to make it a little more, clear, we're using some shorthand here, but normally you would have curly braces and stuff. Again, same thing going on here. Again, we have an input, and then we have a function body that returns something. So this is basically automatically going to take in the previous value that we were using. So whatever the value of counter was previously gets passed into this function, and then we're going to return the new value that we want based on the previous value. Now the question is, why do you need to do this? Why can't we just do counter +1? This gets into another important part about use state, or I guess the updating, in that things are asynchronous. So big fancy word here, asynchro, I always misspell it, synchronous. That's maybe. All right, asynchronous, our buzzword that we're going to be using here. We'll talk about asynchronous JavaScript, I think, next week, but asynchronous code basically means that something is going to be done in parallel. It's going to be done kind of outside of our timeline. So if we do something asynchronous, that means when we do, let's say we have line A and line B. If line A is asynchronous code, that means when we get to line B, there's no guarantee that whatever line A was doing executed fully. So set counter here is an asynchronous function call. Again, this is getting a little more technical, but what this means is counter is not updated immediately. If you guys want me to prove that to you, let me add in a console log right here. All right, so we're updating the value of counter, and then we're going to log the value of counter also. What is going on here is set counter is essentially queuing up a change that React will eventually apply to the state value. Again, the words I'm using are key. So set counter is not going to immediately update the value of counter. It's going to stage a change that React will eventually, when it's ready for it, it's going to update your state value. So now that I have my code like this, let's actually take a look at what we get printed out to the console here. So go back to my window here, click, I want to call it click me, just get back to what we had, click me. All right, so when I click this button the first time, let's take a look at what's printed out here. So I click, notice that my value in my display says you click this button 1 time. However, my console printed out 0, because that is the old value of counter. It's not the updated value. This will continue. So this value out here is going to lag behind by 1. So I click again. Notice that it says you click this button 2 times, but my console output was 1. Now, this is not intuitive. You might be looking at this code again and say, well, look, I'm updating my counter the way you told me to, and then I'm printing out the new value of counter, right? Like counter should be updated now. That's not how this works here. So set counter, this is asynchronous. This is an asynchronous call, meaning this will happen eventually, but it's not going to happen immediately. So when we get down to line 19, this is still processing, as in that update still a stage somewhere. It has not happened right away. Again, that's a lot to think about. but let me pause here because we're talking about a lot of new things. What questions do you guys have about asynchronous functionality or kind of how this is working?
Ankur?
Yep, go for it.
So on line 21 right there, the word prev is actually really important, right? Because it's referencing capital letter C counter. So I guess all the naming will follow that convention because the naming here actually does something.
No.
It doesn't.
Yeah, this is just naming convention, but it's not required. I can name this donuts if I want, donuts counter, and then donuts counter. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Prev is just signaling to you that this is whatever the previous value of counter, you just want to update it by 1. But it is just it's optional naming. Usually you'll see it this way, but that is not required for functionality. But yep, always good to kind of clarify that. So good question there. But yeah, this is just a variable we're capturing in something we call prev counter. We can name it anything we want to. We're going to use it in our functions, return it +1. This return value is what the new value will be set to when React is good and ready to apply the change. Why is this more proper than the proper way? This is where we talk about the asynchronous item here. So hypothetically, what if we did something like this? Let's say we want to update our counter by 2s or 3s or 4s. If we want to update by 4, this is not going to work because when we call set counter here, we call set counter immediately, and that's going to use the old value of counter. You guys follow that? Remember when we console log counter out here? This counter value was not updated immediately. So we call set counter and we call set counter again immediately after that. This is going to refer to the old counter, not the new counter value that was set here. So let's take a look at this and see what happens. So I'm calling set counter 4 times in a row right away in succession, but the first set counter is not going to resolve by the time I call set counter again. So my goal here is to increment by 4, right? Let's actually see if that happens. So we're gonna track that. Let's take a look here, refresh. When I click, notice it says 1. That then did not increment by 4. If I click again, it goes to 2. So we're still incrementing by 1, even though I have 4 separate set counter calls. Again, the problem here is that counter is not updated immediately. So that's why the more proper way should be the way we're doing it. But again, I don't want to overcomplexify things. But if we do it this way, where I add 4 of these, now what's going to happen is that set counter is going to be called once. This prev counter is going to take on the new value that is staged for the next update. So this prev counter will actually equal prev counter plus 1. So it's going to actually take the value from this return and pass that into here. So now I should accurately get an increment by 4 if I'm not lying to you here. So let's take a look. I'm going to uncomment this. Again, the problem of console logs still exists, so that's not taken away. This counter will still be lagging behind because it's not a part of this chain, but our counter should be incremented by 4, assuming that this is all correct. So let's take a look. Let's make sure this actually works. Click. All right, notice we went up by 4 now. Click, 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 click. You guys got that? So again, it's subtle, but you can run into issues because you should not refer to the old value when you're updating it to a new value. This is the more proper way to do it. It's very nuanced. You can get away with doing this most of the time because you're not going to be calling the same updater in succession. But if you are, you need to use this method to do it correctly. Make a big smile there. Questions about the more proper way, the proper way, or the bad way? Again, this concept is essential for you guys to understand. If you ever catch yourself updating state values, the unfortunate thing is React is not going to complain, right? When I did counter equals counter plus 1, React didn't throw an error. Like React was like, whatever, like, I don't care. This is legit. This is valid syntax. This works, but it's not going to work within your React framework. What questions do you guys have?
I guess for me, what I'm just having trouble connecting is how does previous counter know that you're referring to counter?
So this is a parameter that's being passed in for us. So this is some React magic. When we have an anonymous function here, React is going to give us the previous value of counter to this function. So we're going to accept that here and just increment it and return the new value that we want based on the current value. So maybe I should name this current value instead of previous value, but it's essentially the same thing. So React gives us our current state value. We return what new value we want. And then the React magic is smart enough to know that if we call it again, the value we get here is going to be the return value from the previous call that happened.
Okay.
So these changes are being staged, but React is managing them. So again, with that management, we can get the correct like intermediate value, even though the rendering hasn't happened yet.
So, and those variables can still be called anything that we want.
Yep, you got it. I could call this, donuts, and then I call this cupcakes. Yep, they're just variables we're creating. Again, I am not the best variable namer, and I love baked goods so much, but yep, if I name this donuts and cupcakes, works just the same. We're just capturing a value passed to us, and then, oops, typo, cupcakes. Why can't I type today? Cupcakes. All right. Yep. Should work the same. Like I got an increment of 5 somehow. I'm not sure how that happened. I'm getting 5. Oh, because I'm calling it up here too. Yeah, we want 4. So click me, refresh. Cool. Good questions there. All right. I think we've earned ourselves another break here. So it's 11:32. All right, so we covered dealing with state values. Again, just to summarize state values, this is the appropriate way to create and update values for React purposes. Again, we could create like a global variable, right, and manage it that way, but this is not going to work again. We need to use React's framework. In this case, we need to use state in order for our updating, our rendering to be automatic for us. If we create like a separate global variable or update our state values directly, our rendering is not going to update, as we saw with our example. All right, so those are state values. Again, state values are internal to components. So I created this counter inside of my component, and I'm using it internally. That is what a state value is using React's terminology. All right, the other side of things, or not other side really, but the other type of value we might have are called props or prop values. Short form for properties. Props are external data to a component. They're external data values for a component. There are values that are passed down from a parent component down to a child component. So this is very similar to how like we pass parameters to a function, and that function can use those values. Same concept here, where we pass prop values to a component, and the component can use those values to do whatever it needs to do with those values. All right, to kind of see props at play, we're going to restructure our code that we've written so far. I'm going to go to the curriculum page just to kind of save some time. So we talked about components, we talked about state values. Again, there's a lot of good material here. Let's go down to prop values. I'm going to copy this updated snippet. We're going to have a few files that we create. So this is a good time to talk about file organization. Let me copy in the new code, drop that here. All right, so what we've done here, we're going to create separate components for different parts of our application. And this is how React is meant to be structured, where you create multiple components and kind of use them together. So in this case, I'm going to create a new component called my button, and another new component called my label. So to do this, I'm going to create a new folder in my source folder and call it components. I want to emphasize that this is just for file organization sakes. You don't have to call it component. You call this folder whatever you want. You don't have to create a folder. You can just create all your files on the same level. But for better file organization, it's usually better to create a nested folder and add your components there. So I'm going to create a folder called components. Again, just a naming item. You don't have to call it components. Inside of there, I'm going to create a new file called mybutton.js. And also create a new file called mylabel.js. Note that my naming is going to match the name of the app, or sorry, the component that I want to create. So my button, uppercase M and B, because my components can be named my button. But again, this is naming convention, so kind of stick with it. All right, so let's create a functional component from scratch. Again, there's not too much to it. I just create a function. The name of my component will be my button, or this is my label, sorry. It's a function. It's going to return some JSX. I'm going to have my return statement and create a div. One thing I did not mention for components is that you must return at most one parent node as part of your JSX. What I mean by that is if I have one div here, right? Let's say, you know, whatever I had, hello world. That's not what I want. Hello world. Right, this is proper. We're returning one parent element. In this case, it's a div. I could, if I want to, just return this h1. This will work just as well because it's one node. However, if I want to return two items like a paragraph here, this is some text. Notice I get these red squiggly lines. There's something going wrong here. The issue here, again, just to emphasize this, you can only return one top level node. In this case, I have two top level nodes. I have an h1 and a paragraph. That's why normally you want to wrap everything in a div. Again, divs are just empty boxes. They're not going to impact your output. But if I want to return multiple items, I need to wrap that in one single item. Usually it's going to be a div, but again, it could be a span, it could be anything. It could be another, like, you know, a table, whatever I want, but it has to be one parent element. All right, so everyone clear on that? Again, if you do not, you'll get red squiggly lines. React will not be happy with you. If you hover over it, it says JSX expressions must have one parent element. So again, the error is pretty clear. If you guys run into that, you should be able to resolve it pretty simply by wrapping it in a surrounding div or whatever. Questions about that? All right, so my label is my component. Right now I'm going to keep it empty. And then my button will be coincidentally pretty similar. So I'm going to copy and paste. It's going to be called my button. Important thing also, make sure you export your components. Again, this is exporting and importing, something that can be a little tricky, but just know at the very bottom of your component file, make sure you just do export default and the component that you are sending out of this file. So I'm going to have export default my button, and then my label should have the same thing for that component. All right, so this will allow any file to importing it to use your component that you are creating here. All right, you guys with me? All right, so this is a bare bones functional component, and there's nothing really going on here. We're returning essentially nothing. Like, this is an empty div block. It's not going to be rendered, or it's not going to show anything on the rendering. But let's actually move some functionality here. So inside my button, I just want to return a button. This is what we had before. So the ID was my button. This said, click me. Right?
Hey, Uncle, question.
Go for it.
Why doesn't autocomplete work when you're writing JSX?
I'm not sure what you're referring to. What part of autocomplete?
Well, like, I should just be able to push button tab and it should give me the button tags, and it doesn't. Is it because we're writing JSX?
I guess, yeah. Again, we're not writing HTML. We're in a JS file. So I think that might be your reason why VS Code doesn't know that you're trying to write HTML. I'm not quite sure. I've not run into that. On click. All right, so we're gonna have on click handler. We're gonna do something with that. So let's say on button click. All right, so this is my button component. Again, pretty simple, just has a button element in it. My label is gonna be pretty similar. We had a paragraph, so let's create a paragraph. ID will be my output. Paragraph will be you clicked the button some amount of times. So I'm gonna put X. All right, so again, this is my output. This is my input where the user inputs some action. So I'm kind of separating out some functionality. And this is a very trivial example, but hopefully you kind of understand the concepts of breaking apart functionality into separate areas of your code. So I have my label, my button, and then my app.js now imports both those components. So again, I created a component folder, components folder, and nested my components under there. That's why I'm importing like that. All right, now let's go down and look at our rendering here. So again, we're using our components just like HTML elements here. So I have my button component, again, angle brackets, the name of my component, and then I have this item here. What I've highlighted here, and this is my fault, this is bad syntax, so I gotta update the page. If you want to insert a comment in JSX, you need to use this weird format. You can't use JavaScript commenting. So double slashes will not work. You'll get an error. So make sure you change that because the curriculum page did not have that. All right, so this item that I've highlighted here is an example of props or a prop value. In this case, my button is taking in a prop value of handle click, and I'm assigning it to a value of increment counter, which happens to be a function. Again, this is a function reference we're passing down as a prop to be captured with handle click. Likewise, if you look at my label is taking in one prop value. We're calling it my value. Keep in mind, these are whatever you want to name it. They're just like naming variables. You can name your prop values as whatever you want to, so long as you follow naming conventions, as in you can't use like dashes, you can't use underscores, or sorry, you can use underscores, but you can't use spaces. Obviously, that won't work. But I'm calling this my value, and we're setting the value of counter to my value. So again, the prop value is my value. The actual value we're passing down is counter in this case. All right, so again, these are properties, also known as props. Now our parents, so we have a parents component is app. Our app has two child components. One is my button and one is my label. The app has state values. In this case, we have a state value of counter. It's passing a state value down as a prop. That is totally fine. You can pass down state values from the current level down as props to child nodes or child components. Any questions about what we see here? Again, not much has changed. We still have our state value. We still have our event handler. The only thing we changed here, instead of using a button and a paragraph directly, we just had to create a component just to separate that out in this example.
I'm getting the same error you're getting. The one button clicked is not defined from
Yes.
that other button. So I'm wondering.
Yeah, so I did not actually flesh that out. So in my button, I created some handler called on button click, but I've not actually created it. So, we can create that quickly. Do const on button click. It is pretty important to use fat arrow functions. We'll talk about this probably another day, but to take our word for it, use fat arrow functions. Don't use traditional functions. That'll be covered at a later time. But we do a console log. Okay, so let's actually see this. Now that we have this handler, let's go back to our window. Okay, not much has changed. Notice we have X times here because we don't actually have a number that we're displaying. Also, when we click, nothing's going to happen extra. Our console is going to show that we clicked the button. So if I click, notice you click the button, it's going to count up because I'm clicking the same thing over and over. Right, I click that 22 times, 23 times. So that looks like the button click handler is working, but we need to kind of link up these two components that are now separated in our logic. So that's being done by the parent node. So my button cannot communicate with my label directly. They're separated. They have no relationship directly, but they are related through this parent component of app. So app can facilitate the data flow between these two components. So we have our increment counter, which we're passing down as a prop for handle click. So this would allow us, our my button component, to use this handler and call this function in our parent component. Does that make sense? So again, we're passing down increment counter, which is a function reference, down as a prop so that my button component can call handle click, and that'll kind of call this function for us in the parent component. So let's actually see that at play. If I go back to my button, in my handler, I could just simply call handle first. So this is where I need to introduce props. By design, props will be the first parameter passed to your functional component. And now some of the frustration might be like, well, how do I know this? Well, the short answer is read documentation, get more practice with React to just kind of memorize kind of the structure of it. But props will automatically be the first parameter passed to your functional component. In our example before, like you can look at our app component, notice we take in nothing here. If we don't capture it, that's fine. This is JavaScript, the wild, wild west. As in, if we don't have a parameter, JavaScript will be totally fine with it. But just know that props are being passed to every component that is created. So again, props is going to be specifically an object that we get that contains all the prop values that are passed down to this component. So from that, we call props.handleClick, and then call that function like so. So again, just to kind of trace back our steps, looking at our app.js, we chose a name of handleClick. That is a name we chose. That's not something that's predefined. Since we pass it down as a prop value for handleClick, in our my button, we get props as an object. We can call handleClick off of that props object. In fact, if we do a console log of the props, we can actually see what it looks like. So console log props. Let's just take a look at that. But now this will trigger the function, this function right here, because that is what we specified handleClick is pointing to. So it's going to increment our counter as such. So let's take a look at this, refresh here. All right, so notice we print out our prop values here. So our prop value has one entry in it. handleClick is the key, and the value is an anonymous function that we pass down to it. So in this case, set counter, previous counter, does that look familiar? Yes, that is the function that we pass down to it. You can pass multiple prop values to a component. Again, this is just like elements where they have multiple attributes. So let's say I want to customize this a little bit more. So looking at my button, notice I always have click me as the title here. What if I want to customize that? Well, the parent, if you want to give the parent control, let's say button title. Again, this is just a prop value. I can name it whatever I want to. And let's say in this case, we want to call this click me. Let's change that to push me. All right, so now that we are specifying a prop value here, we can use it in our component. Just like we use handleClick that was passed down to us. If I go down to my button, instead of just always showing click me, we can use a prop value here. So I'm going to do props dot, what do I call it? Button title. Again, the names need to match. So if I save that, now this should update to whatever the parent passed down. So it's a little more dynamic now. We're not hard coding what the button wants to show. Again, this is based on your desires. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to. But now it says push me. Notice looking at the object down here. So let's refresh. I'm printing out the prop values that was the props object that was passed down to my button component. So notice it has two entries now. It has button title with the value of push me, and has handleClick, which is a function reference pointing to a function here. What questions do you guys have about props, how they're being passed down, how they're being accessed? So again, props is an object. Again, if you remember objects in JavaScript, they're the same as dictionaries in Python. Where that's being passed down to our component. We capture it as the first parameter of our function. Again, it must be the first parameter. I can't slide in like some value here, some param. This would not work. Props would not automatically be passed to the second parameter. Some param will now take on the value of props. This is a naming convention again. You don't have to call it props. You can call it stuff, but you want to be, stick with the naming convention. So by default, you can see props everywhere.
So I don't know, maybe I kind of fell a little bit further behind, but as far as all the stuff in the index.js, what did you kind of do with that? I kind of missed that part.
Index.js should not be modified. You should not touch anything extra. I coded some stuff in here just for our example for JavaScript, but you should never be kind of adding stuff to index.js. But app.js is what we were modifying, if that was what you were looking for.
I guess my thing broke without that counter being in index.js. I don't know if did you update something? I don't see that in the platform.
I mean, I just took out all my JavaScript code, so you should not have any additional JavaScript code in your file. Was there a hand raise? Sorry, I don't know if I missed something.
Yeah, I've got one. So when we were doing Django, you kind of separated out the dictionary that was being passed into the HTML by using that like data equals dictionary. Is there a similar way we can break out the props that we're passing into and passing in as a variable?
Sorry, I'm a little unclear on the question. So props here, we're creating props separately. So here we create a handle click value and a button title value. So instead of passing down a dictionary, we pass in individual values. So it's a key name, key value pair. So handle click has a value, button title has a value, and we just kind of add as many as we want to. It's not going to be a single dictionary, if that's what you're asking.
Oh, so each one of these are like separate, like handle click and button title as they get passed, they're not compiled into an object.
They are. Sorry. So I'm providing them individually, but inside my button, they're all captured in one object. So again, this is an object that has each of those entries. So if you remember when I printed out, when I print out that props object, I get button title and the value for it and the handle click and the value for that. So it is an object that gets passed to your component. You don't pass it as an object, it gets passed down as an object.
Okay.
I think you can with if you use the same names that you passed them down as, and you use a spread operator, you can pull them out without using the props dot, but that's later on maybe.
Yeah, you could destructure it. I think we covered destructuring at a later date, but yeah, there are different ways to access this, but just kind of understand props is an object. You can capture stuff like, you know, this and that. I'm not going to go into that, just to keep it simple, but yeah, there are different variations on how you might capture props. But all right, so we get a props value, and then we could use whatever we want off of it. So in this case, handle click is a function reference, so we call it like a function. Button title is just a string, so we use it as the title or as the content for our button. All right, but one more thing we need to do. We have you click this button X times. Yeah, there's a question out there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just
You're
trying to get some of the naming down. Our function in app.js that is named app, that is a component. Is that correct?
Yes,
This is a
correct.
component.
Yep.
And my button.js and my label.js are also components. Is that correct?
Yes, this function here is a functional component. Basically, what makes a functional component is you create a function and return JSX. That's like the simplified version of it. So yeah, these are all functional components. My label and my button.
Okay, on my button.js, where we define on button clicked, that
Yep.
function, are we allowed to put that code outside of the function my button? Like, could we put that above function my button, or does all that code need to be inside that component name function call? Does
Yes.
that make sense?
In this case, it must be, and in most cases, you always want to keep your handlers inside your function. The reason is because this props value is local only to this function, right? So again, although this is a component, it still has the rules of a function. So it takes in a parameter of props. We need to access props inside this button click handler. So we need to have button click inside of this function. So yes, it's a nested function within a function. But we need access to props, so it must be here. All right, cool. So that is props. Again, one thing we need to do is you click this button X times. We actually want to show the number here. So this is another use case for props where we have my label. So my label can take in props, and we can, instead of just displaying X here, we could say, we'll do props.counter. Now, how do we get counter passed down here? Well, that's what the parent needs to do. So we go back to app.js, right? That's a parent component. Click on that. So we have my label, which we're rendering right here. We're taking my values. It looks like I misnamed it. So let's change it in my label. So kind of calling it counter. I decided to call it my value. Again, this is a naming choice. I just want to kind of highlight that you can name it whatever you want. So in this case, if I call it my value, my parent will pass down, a value to my value. And in this case, we're passing down counter, which is a state value from our app.js or app component. So now that we actually pass on a value, my label should appropriately get the correct thing to display. So here we go, push me, and we're back to where we were before. All right, the reason we made this change was one, to kind of give you an idea of separating out logic. Again, you don't want to have one component that does everything for you. You want to modularize it so that different functionality is nested into different components. Again, in this example, very trivial. Again, it doesn't make much sense to just have one component that has a single button in it and one component that has a single paragraph in it. But again, this is just for example's sake. But now that we split it out, you're using props that kind of pass values back and forth. In this case, this is a typical design where we'll pass a functional reference as a prop value so that your child component can call back up to your parent. Normally, there's no direct way for a child to contact the parent. But in this case, since the parent provided a function to call down as a prop, the child component can call back up to that parent in this manner. So this is used to call back up to the parent to notify the parent, hey, some action happened, do something as a result. That action we want to do is basically update our counter like we were doing before. And then we're using props also to pass down a value. So in this case, my label needs to know what the counter is actually set to. So anytime that changes, it'll automatically be updated in my value, and then my label will be re-rendered with the correct output. So again, a lot of React gears turning here, but again, React will automatically update for you anytime prop or state values change. The same rules apply for state values. You should not update prop values directly. What I mean by that is you should not do something like props.myValue and decide, hey, I want to override it. So I'm going to say, I'm going to call this hit me, or sorry, I'm going to set this equal to 77, right? This will not work because React is not going to know that you updated a prop value. So, in this case, it actually throws you an error because it's a read-only property. But if you change it to destructuring, kind of getting ahead of myself, I would do like this. You can still update it, but that's still bad. Props not defined. So do my value. Probably gonna lose you guys here, but again, this is another way to capture a prop value. This is called destructuring. We'll cover that in another lecture. If I do it this way, this will allow me to update this, but it's not what I want. I guess it did actually throw it there, so that is still, regardless, don't update prop values directly, and you'll be better off for it. All right, so state values, prop values, do not update directly. So we are reaching that critical time of day where we want to break for lunch. So we do have one more segment to go over. That's going to be class-based components. Luckily, it's not going to introduce any new concepts, but it's going to introduce new syntax. So let's stay tuned for that after lunch. Let me pause recording here.